So, welcome to the last edition of the History of the On the Edge lectures in this year. And I'm happy to introduce Andreas Guidi, our fellow at the Institute, for the next 2 weeks. And he is also an associate professor at the INALCO in Paris and a member of the CRI also in Paris. Before joining the INALCO, he obtained his PhD in 2018 between Humboldt University in Berlin and École des Hautes Études et Sciences Sociales in Paris. And later on, he was a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Constance and a visiting scholar at the German Historical Institute in Washington, D.C. But more importantly, his research focuses mainly on the contemporary history of the Mediterranean and the Balkans, and in particular the history of imperialism, colonialism, and fascism, as well as in the history of youth and generations. So he explored these fields through a study of Rhodes and his award-winning first book, Generations of Empire, Youth from Ottoman to Italian Rule in the Mediterranean, which focuses on Rhodes. And lately he is working on a second book on the history of illicit trade in the Mediterranean from the 1940s to the 1960s. And in this particular scope, we will hear today about the smuggling of cigarettes into the free territory of Trieste. Very interesting topic, which is also connected to our territory in this gray zone when everything was apparently possible. Usually when we think about Trieste, we think about some other illicit trades or smuggling, and it's usually connected with the currents which went into Yugoslavia and to little more usual items as jeans and other commodities. But apparently Trieste was also a hub practically for smuggling cigarettes into Europe, and I am very interested into what you have to say, especially on the fact that I was chosen to run this talk because my father was a custom officer on the same border, so let's say that that's my personal interest in this topic. So please, Andreas.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Yuri, for this introduction. And of course, thank you everyone at the Institute for having me and also for coming to this talk today. I'm really happy to be here, and I also look forward to talking to you more in the next days, as long as I'm here. Yuri already gave you an overview of today's talk, and also I just want to briefly mention that again, this is a very much a work in progress, and I started to collect sources, and please do not expect any very sophisticated conceptual look at this topic, because I'm still working on it, but it also means that of course I'm very receptive in terms of any comments and suggestions you might have. Also, another very quick disclaimer, as Yuri also mentioned, this is just a part of a large endeavor related to my second book project that really explores a broader region of the Mediterranean, and not just cigarettes and not just Trieste. So this is the idea is to work on this topic for a chapter of this second book. So let's start with an article that was published in the Italian newspaper L'Unità in the summer of 1953, entitled Contrabbando a Trieste, so smuggling in Trieste. I will just sum up the main aspects evoked in this article. So basically, in the 7 days before this investigation came out, 4,500 kilograms of smuggled American cigarettes were seized by the custom police in Trieste. These cigarettes were almost exclusively from Switzerland, and they were transiting through the Socialist Federal Republic of Slovenia and were then reached their final destination in Trieste. The article also mentioned the direct involvement of the Yugoslav state, and in terms of geography and places, also mentioned localities like Draga or Sant'Elia, really close to the border. Sejana, of course, one of the main transit points, and the coastal town of Ankaran. But it also mentioned big names like the then Italian Prime Minister Alcide de Gasperi, who was considered incapable of stopping this smuggling. But on the other hand, they also mentioned Italian workers, and more specifically Italian fishermen that were allegedly harassed by the Yugoslav coastal police for other types of economic transactions. In the conclusion, the article also mentioned that this incident, the seizure and the investigation, related to a broader transnational underworld in Trieste. They, for example, talked about rich men behind all these shady transactions, possible link with the white slave trade, as the trafficking in women was still known at that time, and also narcotics trafficking, more precisely opium and cocaine. So I also tried to show on the map the main route that basically was described in this article. As I mentioned before, it was published in L'Unità, and this is also not a coincidence because, as you know, the newspaper was the official organ of the Italian Communist Party at the time, and since the article came out in 1953, it is of course worth mentioning that the Italian Communist Party had a pretty clear anti-Titoist agenda at that time during the still ongoing Tito-Stalin split. So they seized any opportunity to basically denounce the involvement of the Yugoslav state in criminal activities. This, of course, raises the question of the broader political dimension of the early Cold War and the Trieste question. But, of course, I will try to link this to the question of business in terms of American cigarettes. That was a booming trade in the late 1940s and early 1950s. So newspapers across Europe reported about the smuggling of these cigarettes. Tribunals in several countries opened judicial cases. Reporters and the smugglers themselves gave testimonies in reportages and memoirs. So what this article in particular does not mention, at least explicitly, is that Tangier, another very important port city in the Mediterranean region, functioned as the main hub, the main entrepot of American cigarettes in the Mediterranean. So the focus here, of course, is on the city of Trieste itself as another hub of illicit trade. But what I will try to show in my talk is that this happened. So Trieste became an important spot because the city was embedded in a larger transnational circuit in this maritime region. So very quickly, because I'm pretty sure you know this better than me, a few notes about the context of the Free Territory of Trieste that is at the core of my talk. So it was a particular territorial arrangement established in 1947 following the peace treaty with Italy, signed in February of the same year. And then basically it foresaw the creation of two zones. One, the zone A, administered together with the Allied military government and Italian institution that you see here in the light green area. And the zone B was the equivalent, but administered with Yugoslavia, and it was in itself divided in two subzones, one that later also became part of Slovenia, and the other one in the south to Istria, and so the Republic of Croatia. I mentioned the Allied military government that is particularly important for this topic because they were also responsible for a part, at least, of the police in this territory. Another interesting aspect is that the same peace treaty in the Annex 8 also provided for the creation of a free port in Trieste. And here I also mentioned the two articles that I singled out to explain that it was basically considered a customs-free port. So goods in transit were exempt from taxes. But of course, it was illegal to then re-export goods without declaring them to the customs in other countries surrounding the port. So it was basically only conceived of as a hub for transiting goods. And you can see in Article 8 that the question of smuggling was already mentioned as a problem at the very beginning of this arrangement. Now, smuggling between Yugoslavia and Italy, and more precisely between Slovenia and Italy, and also in the whole region around Trieste, has already been studied by authors such as Marta Verginella and Vida Rojas Darovec, in terms of like everyday exchanges, and more in particular also the role of women in this small-scale illicit trade. And Yuri also mentioned the question of jeans, farmerke, that was also studied by, for example, Breda Lutar in her study about cultural consumption. There is also a recent study by a Slovenian colleague, Rado Pesdir, who investigates how the Slovenian state already in Yugoslav times was involved in illegal activities and shady market transactions. And I also want to mention the ongoing ERC project in Koper, led by my colleague Borut Klabian, Open Borders, that really has a broader scope in studying these transactions between Italy and Yugoslavia in the northern Adriatic. So, to be sure, the local, the cultural, and the national economic perspectives that I just mentioned are, of course, important and insightful, but I also want to propose a different approach that is based on three elements and three arguments that I try to list here. So the first one, of course, yes, the story of American cigarettes in Trieste is a story of cross-border activities. And linked to this is, of course, the political question of how national security was threatened by the activities of international brokers, of foreign agents, and of fifth columns. This is what you can find in most articles in the press, both in Italy and Yugoslavia at the time. There's a second aspect that really interests me, is the question of regional connections. So basically going beyond the Trieste question in diplomatic and geopolitical terms, how this economy basically worked, how it saw the involvement of states, but also of private forces, be it individuals or small or large enterprises, and also how this question of connections allows us to think together the mobility of people and the mobility of commodities. There is a third element that I'm really interested in for my book, and that is about the territorial transformation in the Mediterranean. So what I will try to do in the later part of this presentation is to come back to these spatial connections, for example, between Trieste and Tangier. That is a very important link to explain the cigarettes economy, and how this type of links raised anxieties because we talk about territories, zones, and areas that had very specific regimes. So they had unstable juridical and economic systems of sovereignty, and they were still part of this Mediterranean landscape in a time where basically The overall idea is to nationalize the territory, to reinforce national sovereignty and control over space. So this comes at odds with these specific settings like the free territory of Trieste and the international zone of Tangier. There is also another level that I wouldn't list up here, but it intersects with all these questions. And it is the question of imaginary. So how the question of smuggling really changed the perception of the whole Mediterranean. And to give you an example from a local French newspaper, I couldn't find a more striking aspect, but I think it really hits the point I'm trying to raise here, is that basically due to the activities of the crime syndicates and smuggling rings, the press produced this perception of the Mediterranean as turning again into a sea of pirates, where outlaws and people with a very complex transnational backgrounds were basically organizing these illegal economic activities. So let's start with the first aspect related to the cross-border economy, and I will try to give you a glimpse in some findings that I recently retrieved from the archives here in Ljubljana, and I will also try to expand during my stay here. So as you probably know, the reason why the archives here are so important for those studying, political questions in the early Cold War Yugoslavia is that access to the UDBA files, so the surveillance and intelligence section of the Ministry of the Interior, is much easier than, say, in Belgrade or other former capitals of the different republics. And also, of course, it's a particularly important spot because it's part of this, of course, border area that I described today in my talk and more broadly in my chapter. So I will not read out the whole excerpt, but I just want to single out some elements and sentences. So this is basically a report by the Slovenian branch of the UDBA, talking about basically all the activities concerning national security and counterintelligence around Trieste. There is a chapter called Illegal Trade, as you see, Ilegalna trgovina, where the author mentions that the UDBA succeeded in building good connections in foreign countries and a thorough understanding of the international economic market and monetary policy. They also managed to circumvent foreign monopolies and their customs regulations and also deal with goods of foreign origin. They also stressed that they were developing illegal business mainly in the Koper Trieste area, and that this operation basically brought us a profit in 1949 alone of about 15 million Italian lire. And for the whole section of the UDBA, so at the federal Yugoslav level, 35 million lire. So here you also see it's a screenshot from a YouTube video that shows you basically one of the customs around Trieste, not at the harbor, but in the surrounding area. In another excerpt, the same report mentioned Koper as the main center for this trade in American cigarettes, and explains the modalities. So basically, how these goods were moved and who actually was responsible for these operations. So they mentioned a manual warehouse and the number of men with trucks that basically, together with the ships, were responsible for this mobility of goods. And I also quote the report: in addition to general supervision of the delivery of goods to ships, the UDBA services, together with our bodies abroad, control the contact points in Italian ports. They also take care of correspondence and payment for the goods in Trieste and set the selling price of the goods in advance. Given the increased tension appearing at the border with Italy, we have decided to move the current depot in Ankaran to certain bays on the eastern coast. So here I just added a photo of Ankaran. I couldn't find many, but I think it sums up the contrast of a very peaceful, basically summer resort holiday that was already popular back then in the early 50s, and this kind of shady economy that was supposed to remain invisible. And the question of visibility and visibility is something that will also come up more or less explicitly in my talk. So by reading this report, I asked myself the question of who is actually the mind behind this kind of master plan, who organizes the whole circuit. Of course, it's a tough question to answer, but this also led me to another lead that proves to be at the same time promising but also disappointing. So this is the right time to introduce you to this character, Ratko Dražević. I don't know if you've ever heard about him. So he has become, again, very popular in Serbia in recent years, thanks to many publications in tabloids, especially on the internet, like Espresso, but I could mention many others that keep on telling the same story. And the interesting thing is that he is as visible in this type of media in recent years. There's kind of a rediscovery of this character, but he is completely invisible in the archives. So I worked in archives in many countries, and I never came across an explicit mention of Ratko Dražević as being part of this economy. So who was this guy? Basically, the Serbian online newspapers refer to the biography of a very a man for all season, one could say, who also made a career in the UDBA, but then even before that, he was part of the Secret Service already during the Second World War, and apparently he was responsible for many killings of political opponents and former Chetniks in Serbia. Then he became also involved in Yugoslav enterprises, and this is the part that I'm more interested in. Is mentioned as a spy, and then as a very legal character as the leader of Avala Films, which was one of the main film companies in Yugoslavia. And apart from that, there is also his side, let's say, as a womanizer or a playboy that Serbian media really likes to highlight. Like, for example, you can see in the title, I don't know if I have killed more people, or if I had more than the number of women I slept with, basically. And as the title suggests, luda priča, so crazy story. So I'm interested in the crazy story because it also touches upon the question of American cigarette smuggling in the early Cold War. The interesting thing is that all these recent articles refer to a longer interview carried out by Milomir Maric, who is now known in Serbia as the director of Happy TV. No need to talk about the quality of this channel, but a very popular one. And as a young journalist, he interviewed many characters of the Yugoslav regime in the previous decades, and he published in the illustrated magazine Duga, very popular in the early 90s, a series of 3 interviews with Ratko Dražević. And in the third part of the interviews, Dražević talks about his role as the organizer of illegal economy, basically in the early years of Yugoslavia. As again, the very sensational title mentions, we robbed banks better than, or more than Stalin, better than Stalin. As you know, the young Stalin was also involved in bank robbing and other illegal activities. But what is interesting is that he gives a pretty precise description of how this system worked. The problem, on the other hand, is that, again, no mention of his involvement is to be found in archives. So this raises maybe a broader epistemological question of to what extent we can use these testimonies as sources. But to be fair, although we need to take these accounts with caution, this story actually aligns really well with the details found in other testimonies and reports in the archives, as well as in press investigations. So let's say it's very realistic, although the details do not always match in terms of names and the direct involvement of this character. So I still don't know to what extent I can follow this lead, but it makes me think about how to use other sources to describe this phenomenon. For example, one could mention another article that was published by the Italian newspaper L'Arena di Pola in 1943. And the interesting thing is that here you have a very different perspective than that one that I mentioned in the opening of l'Unità. So if l'Unità was the official newspaper of the Italian Communist Party, L'Arena di Pola was basically one of the publications of irredentist circles after the displacement of Italians from Istria and Venezia Giulia and Dalmatia after World War II. They opened basically a kind of exile newspaper in which, from a totally different perspective, they also denounced the direct involvement of Belgrade and Yugoslavia in organizing this smuggling of American cigarettes in Italy. So as you can read in the title, Belgrade runs the smuggling of American cigarettes in Italy. Again, I will not read the whole newspaper, but in terms of topics, it kind of rhymes with what was described by l'Unità. So again, also the attacks on the Italian government because they do not enough to protect Italian fishermen, and at the same time they do nothing to basically hamper the smuggling of illicit goods from Yugoslavia to Italy. In terms of geographic places, it's also interesting that this article mentions Rovinj and not Ankaran, which might kind of echo with what the report from the Slovene archives was telling us. So basically that they were moving the operations from Ankaran further south to Istria. There is, however, a misunderstanding in this newspaper, because although, of course, the author is very aware that the cigarettes are American, the hypothesis that has no basically match in other sources is that the US-American government would directly provide basically Yugoslavia with cigarettes, so that there is a kind of direct transaction between the US and Yugoslavia, which is not the case. So, of course, this raises the question of how these cigarettes came to Yugoslavia in the first place. So, if you read these articles, there is, a very complex geography, as I mentioned before, a lot of places and even names of people. So one can start to basically realize a map, how the map could look like, but there is also no very clear description of who basically was responsible for what. So there are sometimes lists of names and lists of places, but it's not enough to understand how the system works. Also, another thing that is quite interesting is that if you move to the Yugoslav press, and this is an article, not even an article actually, it's basically like a sort of a short story that is fictional, but again addresses the same question from Borba in 1956, so slightly later. Basically, it's a story of two Yugoslav coastal guards who spot a small boat off the island of Vis, so between, we were talking about it earlier on, between the islet of Sveti Andrija and the rock of Jabuka, basically, that I marked here on the map. And so basically they intercept this small boat in which Italian smugglers, as the article says, are trying to bring American cigarettes from Trieste into Yugoslavia, so the opposite direction, to Hvar, although they declare when they are busted that their destination is Ancona. So basically the Yugoslav press uses the story to completely revert the narrative and basically denounce how Italian smugglers were trying to bring cigarettes from Trieste illegally into Yugoslav territory. So it's a very symmetric description. So again, this is not enough to understand how these cigarettes came to the Trieste area in the first place. To understand this, I have to move to the second part of my talk that has to do with regional circuits. And in the, as I was advancing in my research, I realized that quite a few sources mentioned a Swiss company called Weitnauer, which is not very well known, but it's still a very leading company in like duty-free and import-export until today. So many in many airports, they have a very precise knowledge of borders and customs. And apparently they were also involved in this economy of American cigarettes. So they are based in Basel. They are, by the way, also mentioned by Dražević in his account, and in which he claims that he had direct contacts with some of the agents of this company. And so there is a part of truth in all this, and this is confirmed by sources from the Swiss archives that luckily, at least at the federal Swiss level, are accessible quite easily online. So I found this a couple of reports that deal with the question of Trieste and American cigarettes. More in particular, they mentioned this agent, Aleardo Buzzi, that you see here in his later years. He also made a career in Formula One, as he was the one introducing all the sponsors of Marlboro and other cigarettes into Formula One races. So very important character. As a young man, apparently, he worked as a middleman between Switzerland and Yugoslavia and other countries as well to basically circumvene taxes and custom controls. So in 1955, for example, he was briefly arrested by the police in Trieste. So right after Trieste was reincorporated in the Italian state, the Italian police arrested him, and the police officer wanted to check Buzzi's address book, claiming, as you maybe can read here in the report, that he knew a lot of people involved in large-scale smuggling of these American cigarettes. So he insisted that the Swiss diplomats intervene and try to dissuade the police officer, which eventually was the case. So they kept some of his personal records, but as he basically said to the Swiss consul as they were leaving the police station together, luckily they did not take photos of the real important names and contacts that I keep in my wallet. So again, this brings Switzerland and this kind of middleman in the picture. 2 years later, in the summer of 1957, different newspapers in Italy and also magazines like Concretezza, conservative one that you see here on the left, published reports and long reports about the question of smuggling in the Adriatic and more specifically, again, American cigarettes. And the name of Buzzi and also Weitnauer also emerge in these sources. They actually mentioned they mentioned that more than 200 people were accused of being part of a very complex smuggling ring, and Weitnauer was part of it. So, of course, we don't have to go too deep in this type of articles, but the general idea that I wanted to single out is that there is actually a cooperation of both Italian and Yugoslav actors. So it's not just about, the tension between Yugoslavia and Italy as states, but that the smuggling is carried out by people of both nationalities and also third parties like Weitnauer and Buzzi. But still, we can zoom out again. So from the first to the second part of my talk, we zoomed out from just the question of the border to the question of broader networks. Now we can zoom out again and see basically how Weitnauer came, owned so much American cigarettes. Again, where did they come from? And this is basically the third part of my talk that has to do with this broader territorial transformation in the Mediterranean. And how the fact that we can think Tangier and Trieste as two settings together can also relate to this deeper change around the mid-20th century in terms of territorial statuses and regime. So what you see here, I hope you can see something on the left, is a document from this online collection of the Truth Tobacco History. So basically a very large set of documents that were made public by US American authorities starting in the 1990s to raise more transparency about the tobacco business in the US, but also with this, of course, with all the global reach of this economy. And you can just look up for Weitnauer in the search engine, and you will find many papers like this that basically are invoices of very large sums and large amounts of American cigarettes that they were shipped directly from the US not directly, from the US to Tangier, and then from Tangier to Switzerland, usually via Marseille. So this is basically the route that also corresponds to the very first map I showed you. So why Tangier? Tangier was until 1956, so a chronology that kind of aligns well with Trieste, was also kind of international territory, of course with its own specificity. It was considered an international zone in which questions like customs and criminality were dealt with by an international body and representatives of several European states. Now, the interesting thing is that apart from Tangier itself, that you can see on the map, the whole territorial configuration of the Western Mediterranean around the Strait of Gibraltar is very complex. Of course, you have Spain, but then you have also a Spanish protectorate in Morocco until 1956. You have a French protectorate in Morocco that you see in light green, also until 56. You have, of course, Ceuta and Melilla as Spanish exclaves in this area, and Gibraltar as a British outpost. So you can easily guess that this is the perfect, basically, fertile ground for smuggling, because there is a very complex and not very, how can I say, clear territorial status in this region. So this is why Tangier became so important as a hub for goods in transit, of course, due to its geographic position as well. And this is very well explained by these memoirs of a smuggler, allegedly one of the main smugglers active in Tangier, a Frenchman, Henri Hell, who wrote in this book La Route de Blonde basically everything he knew about customs and about this type of business. So Weitnauer, as I was mentioned, purchased a huge amount of cigarettes from the US, and they were declared to be in transit to Tangier and then on the road to Switzerland. The interesting thing is that Henri Elle, in his account, also mentioned that Weitnauer did not only buy cigarettes, but also resold cigarettes to smugglers, because using basically a symmetric method, once the cigarettes were in Switzerland, they were shipped to Marseille and declared in transit, so without paying significant taxes. And then in the port of Marseille, they were taken over by small boats of smugglers who would then bring them to other destinations that those declared in the shipping records. So basically, it's, again, really import-export, and the mindset is basically the same, how to circumvent custom control and border police. So this is not directly related to Trieste, but of course it is important to know that the reputation of Tangier as a smuggler hub has also echoes in other types of sources. What was interesting for me was this long, basically, reportage by a journalist called Aleko Lilius, in which he also describes how he came in touch with smugglers, and he also boarded some ships and followed them in some spectacular smuggling operations. And another story that I'm following for basically the chapter in the book that will be right before the story of Trieste is about an American citizen that you see here in the picture from the US National Archives, Sidney Pally, who is on the front at the wheel of the car. And his arrest in 1952 created a scandal that was reproduced then in the press of many countries, both in North America and in Europe. So these are just a few elements to give you a broader picture of what Tangier looked like. And then, of course, the question is how the route linking Tangier and Trieste can be embedded in this setting. So some sources talk directly about this connection between Tangier and Trieste. For example, here, again in the US National Archives, in the collections, in the records of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, you might have heard about it, the former name of the DEA. They were, of course, mostly concerned with opium, heroin, cocaine, and so on. But occasionally, they also wrote reports about cigarettes. And this is an example in which, for the Italian Guardia di Finanza, so basically the custom and financial police, asked for information related to Tangier and Yugoslavia to the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. So in terms of space, this is very interesting because the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and his agents in Morocco provided information to Italy related basically ships that were moving between Morocco and Yugoslavia. And you see some ship names mentioned here in this report, for example, Crna Gora, Serbia, Macedonia, Slavia, and I could find a picture of the steamship Crna Gora here on the right. So, of course, when we talk about the transnational networks of smugglers, we also have to talk about the transnational or international cooperation of police to hamper this phenomenon. So one last slide is about another direct link between Tangier and Trieste, because, of course, the choice of thinking these two places together is arbitrary, as you know, it serves the purpose for me to describe a connection among others. But it is also true that there are some direct links. So, for example, Colonel Gerard Richardson, a British officer, who also wrote his own memoirs that you can see here on the right, was first appointed as the head of the police in Trieste in the late years of the Free Territory, so in the early 50s. And then he was relocated to Tangier. And I found this letter that, again, he wrote to the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, in which, right after arriving in Tangier, he basically says, and I quote him, "Tangier is indeed a second Trieste. It is completely international." So again, it's a story, I think, that can unfold to explain how two very specific international territorial regimes were part of this transnational smuggling economy. So, to conclude, is the link between Trieste and Tangier just a coincidence? I wouldn't say so. And although it is not the only or even the main route when it comes to American cigarettes, if we think these two settings together, this can offer us new perspectives on modern Mediterranean history. For example, how to link not only Trieste and Tangier as cities, but also the Cold War and decolonization, as two entangled phenomena. And also in terms of spatial categories that we use, the Adriatic and the Strait of Gibraltar are usually not thought together, whereas, of course, in terms of trade, be it legal and illegal, they have a shared history. One could also think, in Mediterranean studies, we are used to, especially when it comes to the modern history of the Mediterranean, we are used to think of three main choke points or gates in the Mediterranean: the Strait of Gibraltar, the Suez Canal, and the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus Straits. And one could even say that Trieste, in a way, although there was no strait, also functioned as a kind of a fourth gate, because it was really like historically a very important port city for Central Europe as an outlet, of course, in the Mediterranean. So again, it's also a way to zoom out from Adriatic or from Italian and Yugoslav. Then we have the Adriatic region, but we can also insert it in a broader Mediterranean scope. So to go back to the point I mentioned at the beginning, this story is part of the territorial reconfiguration in the Mediterranean, in which the dominant trend was the nationalization of sovereign space. But this also coexisted with regimes of exceptions, so to speak, like international zones, allied government, and free ports. And my point is that both the attention and the volume of the attention toward and the volume of illicit economy flourished in the interstices between these sovereign spaces. So when newspapers revealed smuggling incidents to the public, as we saw through several examples, they were mostly interested in linking criminality to local politics and national security. What they did not know, and what my research will try to demonstrate, is that smuggling made and unmade personal and spatial connections that shaped the Mediterranean region in the mid-20th century, and that the political aspects that we can easily find in those articles were well embedded in both the economic rationale of commerce and free ports, for example, and the infrastructural landscape influx in this region. So, thank you.
So, thank you very much for this. I had never thought of the smuggling problem in such a wide scope, and it angles totally new perspectives. But I think that's not only for me, it's also for the public. So if you have any questions.
First, thank you for this fascinating lecture and those connections and those things that are really opens up. They open, especially from our perspective, our history. And maybe I have just two very funny questions or comments. Maybe first is use of the sources, the Slovenian sources, because those sources about food were usually used by parahistorical kind of writers who try to claim that everything was how criminal regime was. So we usually get those sources from there. So there are quite a few books who then connect this food by economy, which is shady, of course, with today's situation, which is bad because the economies are the same, blah blah. So it's a very anti-communist kind of revisionist historiography. So you have used it in a completely different way that we cannot even. I could not even conceptualize that before. So I think it's a huge. It shows how we can use our Slovenian sources for that. Our archives are really valuable for international scholars, and that's why that it's very nice that we have this program of visiting scholars coming here, and another good thing. One thing. And the second thing, which is I'm not usually the person, but here, all those picture materials were just testosterone all over. So it's a very mainly story.
Yeah.
Although also those who were gangsters and those who were actually actually trying to catch those gangsters, like this guy being like Humphrey Bogart. So, we're thinking also about this cultural kind of idea, which is slightly maybe anthropological, gender studies are usually not into it, but here this was so obvious.
Yeah.
So how would you comment this, my first observations?
Yeah, thank you very much, Marco. Of course, the two points you raise are very interesting. And yeah, concerning the UDBA sources, I totally agree. It's also, you can, of course, maybe the political history is different, but it applies also to Italian sources who have a very specific, like, national scope. I mentioned the newspapers. Each newspaper had its own also ideological agenda. The idea I had at first, as we usually say, is to follow the money. So basically, beyond these reports, try to understand how goods came to these places to begin with, and how economic transactions basically worked. So I think the idea is precisely to decenter a little bit this narrow political history and try to put it in this broader narrative of regional transformation and also the question of economy. Because what is interesting is that, again, you have this cooperation between individuals, states, enterprises. So politics and ideology is important if you think of the broader Cold War aspect, but when we use the sources, as you say, I think we can do totally different things. So that really aligns well with what I try to do. And the question of gender, well, it's interesting because, first of all, I mentioned other scholars like Marta Verginella, who really worked on this border area with more specific gender, through a more specific gender lens. I also, it's, hopefully will be published next year. I, together with a German colleague, we edited a special issue of gender and transnational crime in the mid-20th century, in which I also have an article. And a section of this article describes basically the involvement of women in smuggling around Trieste, but not more related to narcotics than to cigarettes. And the point I try to make is that, of course, the sources we use are biased. They are produced by men who worked in intelligence institution, and they are very symmetric with regard to the mobsters and smugglers that they are trying to to follow. Basically, they surely overexpose their masculine identity as cops who try to solve problems of criminality. So another aspect would be, for example, this investigation by Ale Colilius, in which, yes, on the one hand, he lives with smugglers, and on the other hand, it gives very detailed descriptions of brothels in Tangier. So again, the male gaze is everywhere when it comes to this, like, underworld and shady characters that populate it. So yes, it's mostly a manly story, and I think the way to go here is to stress that it contributed to produce some, images of masculinity, because, as a matter of fact, women are very marginal in the sources. But yeah.
And that's very interesting to try to balance a little bit the story with the role of the women regarding smuggling.
Yeah, because they are mentioned in some documents. So what I try to do, for example, in that article that I mentioned, is to see that, it's not just about writing a women history of smuggling and a men history of smuggling, because in many cases, actually, there were couples involved, for example. So women played a role while working together with their men, partners or relatives, for example. So yes, it's not at the center, let's say, of my work, but it's definitely important.
You answered more than I would have
Yeah.
thought.
Yeah.
Could you say something about the scope of this operation or these operations? Are we talking about a few truckloads a month, or are we talking about a few boats a month? Or can you? I mean, is there a way to kind of measure the volume of this illicit trade in cigarettes specifically?
Yeah, there is for sure, and I haven't looked at it as close as I wanted to so far, because of course these reports and even the newspaper articles that refer to official investigations, they give information about the kilograms of cigarettes. And the problem, and this is really something that I discussed with other scholars working on smuggling, is that of course you can try to quantify the phenomenon, but first of all you can never know what the volume of goods that made it through was compared to the seizures. So you can have an estimation of the seized amount, but not of the ratio between the seized amount and the successfully smuggled. So what I could tell you so far is that this economy starts already like in 45, with the arrival of American soldiers and the American Navy in the Mediterranean. And that is also part of some agreements related to the Marshall Plan. So cigarettes were shipped to Europe also together with bread and other commodities. But this is the domain of, let's say, the legal economy. The illegal one, I mean, the point is that if I'm lucky enough to find a report like the one I mentioned from the archives here in Ljubljana, they mention some, profit or whatever, but these amounts are likely not present in the following report. So it's very hard to have basically a graph or something. I know it may sound like a shortcut, but I'm more interested in basically the perception of the phenomenon, and sometimes there is a gap, I would say, between what we would consider basically as an important amount and how the press reacted to some scandals, for example. So yeah, I've been thinking about stressing more the quantitative side of this phenomenon, also because without these sums, it's hard to basically underscore the economic dimension that I'm really interested in. So how transactions work. In order to understand how they work, you need to know about prices, you need to know about volumes, and so on. But I'm still struggling with that. So what I can tell you also is that from the point of view of this Yugoslav intelligence, the idea is to literally flood the local market in Trieste with smuggled cigarettes. But I cannot tell you if they really succeeded because I don't know about how many cigarettes were smoked and consumed within the legal market. Yeah.
I have actually another question. You showed us a few these personal narratives that were published in various magazines mostly, and of course those I guess you have to take them with a huge grain of salt, because these guys were performing as well. But I'm actually wondering if you tried to track some of the protagonists down and use oral sources as well. I mean, some of them must still be alive, although that can be sketchy.
It's also an interesting story because, and I discussed this also with other colleagues, like how do we use these memoirs? I will try, I mean, first of all, especially in France, there is this whole school of research around imaginaries and how basically, the imaginaire social is kind of a way to not to discard these accounts, but basically, again, treat them more as a question of representation than about, hard facts or narratives. But even though I will not basically just replicate what, for example, Henriel says in his book, or Aleko Lilius describes as his own experience with pirates and smugglers in Tangier, they also give bits of information that resonate really well with what you can find in state-produced sources. That, by the way, and this is an ongoing discussions again with other colleagues, it's not like these the Federal Bureau of Narcotics or even tribunals were always producing detailed and exact accounts about what was really going on the spot. So the idea is, of course, to combine different sources and see where they align and where they really diverge. But talking about oral history, luckily or unfortunately, I will not be in direct contact with the smugglers themselves. I guess most of them are dead. But the question of descendants is interesting. Just a few days ago, I got in touch with Henri Hell's grandson, who is a successful entrepreneur. And he basically, I just found a short article in the local French press about his idea to republish his grandfather's memoirs and to make it an audiobook and possibly also a TV series, which is, of course, the same idea I had when I was before starting working on cigarettes. I also worked on narcotics, and it's true that when you read these reports, you feel that they are more worth than just a chapter in a scholarly book. It could be a very successful TV Netflix series. So that's it's interesting. But again, I see it more as a way maybe to retrieve some material, like some private documents or pictures, rather than to really take it seriously as an oral history project, because this would again complicate the question of sources and different perspectives. But of course, it's part of the investigation. Yeah.
Okay, so if there are not other questions, I have one. I have many, but I will just we will do that later. I'm mostly interested in the situation after the 1950s. So you mentioned this connection with Yugoslav secret service and Yugoslav state, actually. So do you have any clues if that situation went also through the 70s and through the 80s, since let's say that in the 90s situation changed a little bit, and let's say that there was one Balkan state who was actually the sole idea of its existence, it was to be a hub for smuggled cigarettes into Italy.
Well, again, it's an interesting point. Let's say that for pragmatic reasons, I decided to stop with this chapter in the late 50s. Not necessarily in 1954, so when Trieste is reincorporated into Italy, because actually the reports again talk about basically the aftermath. So smuggling continued, but again, I use smuggling as a way to understand the territorial changes. And so the point is that both Trieste and Tangier changed their status in the mid-50s. It's okay maybe to give it a bit sort of a follow-up, but I cannot write a much longer story until basically the late 20th century. But I have several hints that other, even before the 1990s, like some scandals emerged in the 70s, for example, and in the 80s. The problem is that, of course, the delay for the access to those sources is more complicated. So it's right now, like the early 50s is a perfect moment because it's around 70, 75 years. So more and more files are available, but for later years, it could be more complicated. So there is definitely a later history. And the point one could make is that, even though it's not about international zones or free ports, but what happens further south with Montenegro and Albania, and also Puglia as a region, so the northern Adriatic is less important, and the southern Italian regions are more affected. Again, has to do with territorial instability, with the breakup of Yugoslavia, with the financial crisis, economic crisis in Albania in the early 90s. So, although that was maybe the point of departure, like to write a history of smuggling that would also go beyond these chronological ruptures and just, smuggling in the 20th century, for example, I tended more and more to see smuggling as the object, so not as the subject. So I want to use smuggling to understand certain things related to Mediterranean history. And from that point of view, of course, one can be a bit more flexible with chronology and say, well, if I follow this story until the late 50s, I can understand something about border changes and regime statuses that existed back then. And for the time being, leave the later part of the story for the future. But maybe also like just a brief context. I recently read articles that mentioned that Trieste is still like the second most important port city in Italy after Naples today for the cigarette smuggling economy. So it did remain important. But the whole circuit probably changed compared to the period I look at.
Definitely, thank you. So I promised, but again, we got another question from the Zoom.
Just one more point that just came to my mind. So I'm often also asked the question about what is new about this form of, so not the later story, but if there is like a previous history of cigarette smuggling and tobacco smuggling. And just to give you a short element for the context, of course, it's not like the smuggling of cigarettes or tobacco started after World War II. In the Mediterranean and in the Adriatic as well, it's part of a longer history. But again, what is more interesting for me is that American cigarettes specifically are a novelty of this period. And to understand why they are a novelty, this broader narrative of, the arrival of the US Navy in the region, the whole, presence of American soldiers and authorities and intelligence agencies, this is something new, and this is what I will focus on in my research. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, definitely, because this question of the cultural history is important. Then Jana Javnik also asked, and I will just read that. The trade in illicit tobacco, which encompasses any illegal activity over the lifetime of a tobacco product, including the smuggling and counterfeiting of cigarettes, is often put forward by the tobacco industry as an argument against control measures. But in framing the illicit tobacco trade as primarily driven by tobacco control policies, counterfeiters and organized crime groups, the industry conveniently overlooks its own role in the problem. Have you looked into this yourself?
Thank you so much. I never explicitly thought about it, but of course, it's in reading between the lines. It's something that I often come across when I read the sources, because For example, the role of Weidnauer is a perfect example. They are not officially part of a specific like tobacco industry, but they are really active in this like import and export economy. And of course, this Buzzi, I mentioned, later worked for Philip Morris and so on. So he was both an agent for Weidnauer and a very important person in like the largest brands and companies for tobacco production. Another, I didn't have time to explain this in detail, but probably the main question here is why do American cigarettes arrive in such amounts in the Mediterranean? So there was a surplus in production in Virginia during World War II. And of course, the sites of production, tobacco crops and cigarette productions in Europe, were disrupted during the war. So this created the perfect conditions for American producers to try to find the market in post-war Europe. This is how these cigarettes arrived there. So again, for pragmatic reasons, I cannot also write the history from the American point of view, but of course it's definitely part of the story, and there are some interesting publications about how, again, the tobacco lobby basically pressured the representatives working on the Marshall Plan to include cigarettes in these shipments of aid to Europe. Very recently, so I didn't include it in the presentation, but I found also an excerpt of an interview that Buzzi gave in the 1980s. He briefly talked about his activities and earlier in his life. And he actually admitted that because of more strict custom regulations, import-export companies basically directed a part of the goods into the illegal market. Another element of context that is not probably Mediterranean enough to make it in the book, but I will touch upon it for sure, is that he himself, I don't know, I wouldn't call it a coincidence, but by the way, the region he comes from in Switzerland, so at the border with Italy, the Ticino and Grigioni area, is another well-known border region where smuggling is really part of everyday life. Has been part of everyday life in the last centuries, and you can find even like in the local press and local museums photographs and narratives that actually value this past of labor with local men and women transporting goods across the border, and so there are really several layers. Like there is the entrepreneurial side of the story, there is the labor history side of the story, there is like state regulation. All these elements will somehow, be needed to explain the whole framework, but my focus lies a bit elsewhere, and it's really about these three things that I mentioned before. So how cross-border activities are interpreted in terms of national security, how regional connections are necessary for this economy to function, so transnational actors, and then also how this fits into this broader territorial transformation with like what I didn't have time to expand on, but like other topics that will be addressed in the books are, for example, military occupations, anti-colonial revolts and the role of arms smuggling. There's, for example, in another chapter, I follow a case study of a cargo called Slovenia, that was I don't know if you've heard about it. In 1958, it was intercepted by the French Navy off the coast of Morocco with weapons. probably destined to the FLN, so the Algerian Liberation Front. And what is interesting for me is that, again, it's not just about the history of decolonization or non-alignment, but again, of the question of which authority is responsible to, intervene in open waters, who sent this ship, basically, where the weapons came from, and so on and so forth. And this, again, gives us another point of view on the Mediterranean territorial history in that period. Yeah.
So yeah, I once also went into the question of weapons trade, and unfortunately cigarettes don't have the end user certificates.
Yeah.
And that's basically be much easier.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for your lecture and these new horizons.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing that I have to mention before, I think that I said that this is the last in the year. No, it's the last in the season. So we are concluding the History on the Edge lectures for the summer. And in September, we start again with Francesca Rolandi as the guest. Thank you all for joining. Yeah. The ones who are here can enjoy the coffee. The rest on the Zoom, unfortunately, not.
Yeah. Thank you so much.